We're on? Okay, good evening, everybody. This is the 6th meeting of the Acton Marijuana Committee. Just to remind everybody, our job is to just gather some information on the new marijuana rules and present them at some point, hopefully in the near future, to the selectmen for their consideration. So tonight, we have a couple things. We just finished a conference call with a young lady out in Spokane who is in charge of the air for that county, Spokane County, I think it's called, state of Washington. She's in charge, or it has to do with air quality, which was a good phone call. So not all of us were on it, but James was on, I was on for most of it. Jerry was there, and Mike was on. And so we'll talk about that tonight. The other thing, some of us, Carol and I, were at the seminar that MMA put on Wednesday, along with two of our selectmen, Elise and Kim. So 4 of us were there, and we'll talk about that. We have handouts from that. In fact, why don't we start, unless you have do you have anything else you want to talk about?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm curious on the...
Let's talk about the seminar first. I guess the problem with the seminar was that they set it up and it was supposed to deal with the new rules, which, since we don't have the new rules, the legislature came in on the 23rd of October, passed the new rules, governor vetoed it. Legislature did not overrule his veto, so we have nothing. Only thing we have in statute is what was passed in the referendum. Plus, there were 3 other bills passed, and so we can start, when they started the seminar with that. So we can remind everybody that there were 3 marijuana-related bills that were passed, and so that's in this first handout. Garrett Corbin is as MMA's, we'll keep using this term MMA tonight, which is Maine Municipal Association, which Acton is a member of, along with almost all the other towns in the state. So that's almost 500. In fact, I think it's 509 towns in the state of Maine. And I think there are 500 town members of Maine Municipal Association. So they do broadly represent the municipalities. And they're good at what they do. So they're a very big presence in the legislature. They provide a lot of services to the municipalities, including legal services, and we heard Wednesday from some of their lawyers. In fact, 3 of them were there. One was doing most of the presenting, but Dick Fluellen, who was the older guy in the end, just for Carol's benefit, has probably been there for years, decades, as one of their attorneys, and he's their senior attorney. The guy in the end, the other young lady in the middle, I don't know much about her, but the one who presented this was one of their younger, newer attorneys. So, and the other thing started, this Garrett Corbin is state and federal relations, so I don't know him, he must be one of their lobbyists. And Kate, the other person that did the presenting is their main lobbyist. Kate's last name escapes me. Anyway, we'll get to that. Dufour, thank you. Kate Dufour has been there for years representing it to us. She's now their head lobbyist, I guess. So let's talk. We're starting with this Garrett Corbin. So he reminded us there was some other legislation that passed. So the first page talks about the ballot initiative and then the campaign that was set up. I guess what I wanted to just mention here tonight was this LD 243. Actually, one of the issues that was floating around a lot was who's going to do the rules and who's going to do the administration. And right from the beginning, the referendum basically suggested agriculture, conservation, and forestry was going to be the one. Essentially, this bill, which passed, transfers oversight of adult use of marijuana from agriculture to Department of Administration and Financial Services, and that was confusing to me because the one thing that there's been a lot of discussion of was it was part of that business that was going to be the administrator for this, and in fact that's what this bill said. So it's not Department of Administration and Financial Services, it's the alcohol and lottery part of that that's the legislature says is going to have oversight.
When did that pass?
Well, so that was, does it say here? So that was early in the session. The last session, we can look it up. I don't know when it passed, but
I don't think he said.
he didn't really say
No.
when it passed. But so that's I mean, that was one of the governor's early issues, was that agriculture wasn't necessarily the right place to do this. It wasn't, as far as he was concerned, it wasn't about growing marijuana. It was going to be about administering a recreational use process. And so, but clearly when they got done, when the legislative committee got done, agriculture still had a fairly big part in it. So it's not that they were completely out. It's, right now they're out, but I mean, this basically puts what we call BABLO, that's Bureau of Alcohol and Lottery, is now officially in charge of this licensing.
So, the question then becomes, if somebody's going to apply for a license, it's going to be through BABLO. So in other words, if the citizen initiative becomes the law of the land,
Yeah.
it's still up to these guys to do the licensing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, although it's not clear to me, because it was pretty mixed up in the bill, what function agriculture might still have. We'd have to read this bill, and I don't know specifically.
Okay.
I just want to make sure everybody's aware that there was some things that passed in the legislation that are still in effect, and that's one of
Okay.
them. I'm not sure we're really clear yet on this. So the next one, LD 1636, allows municipalities to establish ordinances banning or restricting marijuana caregivers. So this had to do with medical marijuana, and it's marijuana related. It wasn't related to the recreational use of it. And as I understand it, in addition to that, there were some new rules that went into effect on Wednesday. Are you aware of those?
I'm not sure that the rules went into effect. I think the rules go into effect February 1st, but they did pass a
Rules.
few requirements
Okay.
for the caregiver side of it, yes.
And they did talk a little bit about this. One of the issues that's still floating around, the reason, we try not to mix up the medical marijuana use and the recreational marijuana use, but one of the reasons the governor offered when he vetoed this is what he called loopholes in the medical marijuana issue. So for those legislators that basically sustained his veto, or upheld the veto, that's still an issue floating around out there. And the specific thing I think they talked about, Carol, was this issue of, I think when the medical marijuana thing passed, the people who could be caregivers were somehow restricted to 5 people they were going to be providing marijuana for, if you're a caregiver. And so that's become controversial because some people have interpreted that to mean there can't be more than 5 people in your establishment at once where you're providing this stuff, as opposed to only a total of 5, period, that you're servicing.
5 patients, yeah.
5 patients as opposed to 5 people at a time.
In the store.
Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
I believe what it is, it's they call it a revolving door card.
Yes.
So
Yes.
they would have 4 solid patients, and then the 5th card, you would sign up with a new patient. As soon as your transaction was done, they'd rip up the paperwork and take on the next patient. So it's not illegal to do that. It's
Right.
just when they originally designed the 5 patient slots, they were, expecting people to have 5 patients, and it is just a legal loophole that there's nothing against it. It's just they do frown upon it.
Right.
So
Well, some people are suggesting, I think, that was not what the legislature intended. Apparently, the solution that we heard about Wednesday is that the revolving door thing has been resolved. And I got the impression that meant that there could be, that the revolving door allowed you to have 5 people like in your establishment, or it was constantly revolving. I'm not sure I understand where we're
No,
at this point.
I think what you've described is, and James.
James is
why don't
probably
you-
more
yeah,
your.
I think
yeah,
you're-
the having the revolving. Typically, they have the 5th patient, the revolving one. So they always leave one slot open that a new patient can come in, and and it's legal, you file a
Yeah.
caregiver designation form, and as soon as that's filled out, you're legally the patient's caregiver, and as soon as you can conduct your transaction, after that, if they choose to take their designation card back, there's
Oh.
no law to state that you have to be designated for a certain amount of
So
time
that would
or
allow you
anything.
to then entertain one additional new one. And if
Yeah,
you
well,
always have some-
as long as you're staying within your 5, you use that 5th card as the revolving one, and you have your 4 solid
Okay.
patients. That doesn't change.
So you could literally serve as many patients
Yes.
in a week as you want.
Exactly. As soon as they take their designation card back, they could go to a dispensary or they could go to a new caregiver and
Which
do the
means,
same thing.
which means they could be buying more in a week than they're entitled to, and you could be selling more in a week than the state would expect.
Yeah.
Theoretically.
Yeah, theoretically, it could be possible.
Okay.
So anyway, that bothers some people. That's why there's discussion about this. And I suspect, haven't heard or seen in writing what the governor's description of his loopholes are, but that appears to be one of them, I guess. So anyway, or maybe that's it.
Okay.
The other one about this also was, it did say that the municipality could make it more than 500 feet.
Yes.
So that was also in there.
Yep.
They couldn't do less than, but they could do more than 500 feet.
Right. Wasn't there also some, is there an upper end on that too? Did you get the impression there was that 1,000 feet was, apparently it could be, it's got to be reasonable,
Well,
I guess.
I think, right, you think that was the maximum they were
Well,
allowing?
I didn't hear that there was a maximum.
I didn't either, but,
But I think the assumption is that you can't use this setback to prohibit.
To eliminate it.
To eliminate it by saying, 5,000 or 2 miles or something like that.
Okay.
Then the third one, I think, was the 1641, the testing facilities, which continue to be a topic of discussion. Licensed retail marijuana facility must submit one to a licensed testing facility. And so that was a separate piece of legislation. That's still in effect, okay?
But we don't have any licensees at the
Well,
moment.
do we have to license testing facilities? Didn't somebody say there was a couple in the state?
There are some for the medical side of things.
said.
I'm not sure with,
There's
how
supposed
it's
to be one in Falmouth, somebody told me. Was that part of the, do you remember that, Carol, as part of the?
I do not. I remember that the one gentleman said he only could foresee 3 or 4 within
Yeah,
the whole state.
So.
Okay.
Okay, then they just, spent, the rest of his time was mostly talking about the bill that didn't pass, which we have talked about to some extent. And
Okay.
everybody has looked at.
Was there anything surprising in what he covered, or?
No, except I guess they kept stressing that this thing didn't pass, so we really have nothing. And so then it was speculative from then on. And then the second part of the discussion, when the young lawyer stood up, basically she spent most of her time talking about what we do have.
Right, and I do think that Garrett mentioned that they were pretty upset that this did not pass.
Oh, yeah, I mean,
Because
yeah, they all,
of the regulations.
they thought it was a good proposal.
Correct.
Right,
And
I
it was,
think
what,
that-
15-1 and 1 or something, the committee that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So 13-1 and 1 is a 15-member committee. was it?
17, it was a 17-member,
Was
I
it
think he
17?
said, yeah.
Okay,
No,
anyway, it was a
15-1-1,
big
yeah.
committee vote. Typically in the legislature, if you get a 15-1 vote, with 1 abstention and 1 opposed, that's a pretty strong indication from that committee that it should pass. And so, this, the fact that it didn't pass is despite their 6 or 7 months of work on this thing. So, the Maine Municipal Association, I think, was of the opinion that it was a very, they didn't have everything in it they wanted, but they thought it was a very good piece of legislation. And so they were not happy.
And they
that it
also
didn't
had
pass.
an opt-in instead of an opt-out.
Well, we'll talk. I think that's
Oh.
the major, well, no, that's the major thing.
But that was what this would have had,
Right.
right, the opt-in
Yes.
instead of the opt-out.
Right. So
So-
to me, that was the major part of the whole discussion, was opt-in versus opt-out.
Before we get there, could
Yes.
we take a second and review the tax conversation?
Yep. Let's go to the tax. Okay, so the tax conversation was what we had talked about before. Excise tax, why did they have an excise tax? And it's now become one of the issues, the remaining issues among some of the legislators. As I understand it, now, I'm not sure we heard this, I understand what was reported in the newspaper was that some of the people that voted against this basically were concerned about the excise tax. That it was an attempt to share some revenue with the municipalities. And apparently, there's a bunch of legislators that aren't interested in doing that.
Shocking.
Well, it's maybe shocking, but it seems kind of, they all represent municipalities of some sort, so they, why would they do that? And I think it has to do with something we haven't talked about yet, and that is, as we talk to people in Washington and Colorado, we see as the same thing. There's no municipalities, except in Colorado, getting any money here. Well, we're missing, I think, one of the major questions here, and that is, where does their source of money come from the state? For instance, the state of Washington, which is getting no money from the state, who's paying for education is the real question. For instance, that is the issue. So are they getting a lot of state money anyway? Money goes into the state coffers, the state sends money back. Who's paying for education in the state of Washington? We don't know that yet. Who's paying for other functions that the municipalities? We had a brief question about that today with this young lady in Spokane, and that was about who pays for the air control bureau that she represented. Turns out they don't get any money from the state, but.
Well, it's interesting. We haven't talked about it directly, but,
Right. But the fact that Washington municipalities are not getting any of the tax money going in, what we haven't asked anybody yet is, that may not be such a big deal if, in fact, the state is paying for, a substantial part of their, I don't know what the answer to this is.
I'll,
but we're gonna
actually,
find out.
I can send an email out and ask them,
Yeah.
so give me the
Okay,
comparison. So is it,
So
real estate tax versus, what's the,
well, of all the sources of income for the state, whatever state we're talking about, how much of that income goes back to the municipalities for, and I will guarantee you what it is education. How much of that money that the state takes in is now sent out, well, in Maine, we call it revenue sharing. And it's a hotbed of contention.
so
we
what else
share-
besides education?
Well, I'm just guessing that's what it's gonna be. I mean, you could, state police, gas tax, who pays for, infrastructure, basically, too? Where does the money go? How much does the state of Washington or the state of Colorado fund its municipal functions? That is basically the question.
So, and then the other question, so we can ask how much they're getting from the state, but the other question
Yeah.
is, what's the sources of revenue at the town level other than what they get from the
Is the
state?
state, is the state paying? I mean, that may not be as big a deal as it sounds if the state is in fact paying for some of the major
So-
functions. And education is where it's at. I mean, that's the big expense.
I can send an email out to all the folks
Yeah.
we've talked to and see what they say.
So
So,
So the excise tax versus the sales tax, this started out in the referendum provides for a sales tax. So this legislative committee switched that and instituted this excise tax. And see if I remember this right, Carol. The reason for that was to begin to shove some money to the municipalities, which were, I think that was offered as a reason.
And the excise tax was going to come to the town directly.
Yes.
Instead of going through the
Right.
state and then getting that.
Yeah, and I'm not sure in the
So
legislative.
if you were a grower or producer, you would pay your check to the town, rather than going to the state and then to the
Right.
town, like the sales tax.
but I thought I saw in the legislation that there was a share, we didn't get the whole thing. I thought it was again a 5%
We would get
share of
5%.
collected.
Right, but,
Yes.
So we would have to
No.
remit a check back.
but this is really discussing what the law, that didn't pass anyway, right?
Right. This is still,
And the one that
Understood.
didn't.
I just want to make sure we get this.
okay.
1% of the total sales and excise revenue received by the state, split equally amongst the participating.
That was a separate
5% of
piece.
applicable
Right.
excise tax, 5% of the applicable excise tax revenue generated by establishments in that municipality.
Goes right directly to the town.
Goes to the.
Right, but that's the same as as the retail sales, 5%
5%,
of,
Right.
correct.
so it's only a 0.5% in essence,
Yes.
because you're only getting
0.5%
5%
of
of
the
what's
total.
collected.
But yes, but you're getting the other businesses as well, so you're getting you're getting the growers and the.
Right, but it's still only a 0.5%.
Right.
Okay, so it's.
As opposed to just the sales tax, which would be instituted at the point that it's, becomes a retail sales, as
Right.
opposed to what they used to call value-added tax, which is a
Yeah.
tax on every step of the way of the process. So the grower wouldn't have paid, under the old system, wouldn't have paid any tax. it would have been the retailer or
And-
the
right.
social club that would have
Correct.
collected the tax, so. Okay, is that,
So on $1 million of product,
Yep.
the town would see $5,000,
yes, yeah.
so.
So what we've got is let's see what else is in this. And the
This
chart,
comparison is interesting.
yeah, we couldn't see it. It was up on the board, and so this is the first close look that I've gotten at this.
So it's interesting, you're looking at Alaska.
Yep.
No proceeds to municipalities, but they can, looks like a local option, I'm assuming local option is sales tax? Up to 7.5%.
Yes, so, yeah.
Up to 7.5%
Yep,
local
that's-
municipality.
Yep,
Flat $50 an ounce, flat $15 an ounce on seeds and stems.
so you'll
That's the
see,
excise.
basically, this is one of the major differences between all the other states and Maine, is that we have no local option sales tax, and all the
That's
rest of them do.
That's the big deal.
So, some of it's pretty small, Washington, yes, business.
We were going to get, what, 50% of their licensing fee, right? Wasn't that what it was? that they
I didn't
said?
see that in the
I
law.
didn't see that. in the
I
thing. Did you?
Let's see.
No.
Oh, that was, Rebecca talked about that. That 50% of the cost of the license would go to the town.
That must have been an amendment that I
Yeah.
didn't read.
In the referendum,
Yeah,
so in the referendum.
with the
yes.
citizens, when Rebecca spoke.
Right,
that's
so we'll
what
get
she
to
talked
that, her part of it. But we couldn't see, at least I couldn't see this chart, so I didn't have the sense
I
that,
couldn't see the chart either.
that all of the other states had a local option sales tax, which
Yeah,
is
which is
pretty common.
critical. I mean, and
Yeah.
up to 15% in California.
Yep.
But then, of course, you're getting into competitive pressures.
Yeah.
If you reduce your sales tax, to 10% and everybody else runs at 15%,
Right.
you're going to get way more. But that's not open to us. So anything else in this that's worth looking
Let's
at?
see. Here, we got it.
Okay, these are the control aspects of the omnibus bill. Municipalities may regulate establishments.
Yep.
Home rule.
Again, I think for me, as we get to the next one, the opt-in, opt-out thing was the
Okay.
major message of the whole
Okay.
effort.
Let's move on.
So, Carol, do you have anything else you want to add to that? So the other one is
I think I'm
essentially
starting to-
Rebecca McMahon was one of their relatively new lawyers. Her buddies were there that were essentially, and you'll see it on the first page. So her presentation was primarily about the referendum, what is in it. And for me, it was that bullet down near the bottom, municipalities must opt out to prohibit. Now, right now, it doesn't really matter because we're all under the moratorium, right? But that is done as of February 1st. So if a municipality hasn't opted out by February 1st, and the legislature does nothing to extend the moratorium, and we haven't opted out, then we're open for business.
So what if you have a moratorium in place? Does that count or not?
That does count,
Okay.
yes. So we would be in the 180 days and with the option of going for another 180. But,
And if you heard her correctly, like I did, somebody asked about the moratorium, and
Yes.
she said it can be renewed indefinitely
Yeah.
as long as there's a reason, which is different from what we had talked about a few weeks ago.
Right.
So, and not by the people, but by the selectmen.
right,
How long
but.
did it-
but
What was the
that's-
reason piece of it?
Well, wait a minute, that's when Flewellen weighed in. This is the
That was
old-
what?
Where Dick Flewellen weighed in, the old lawyer. So basically, he's saying, and this is historically, you do not see municipalities going beyond two chops at a moratorium. Don't forget, this has been around for a long time. This is
Right.
not new. Because at that point, you're opening yourself for the contention that you're trying to institute a prohibition on something, whether it's massage parlors or marijuana sales or whatever. Moratoriums have been around on controversial issues for quite a while. So, two bites at the apple, courts have been okay with that. You try to go again, if you don't have a good reason, if you can't show that you're making a justified effort to solve the problem, you probably aren't going to get.
Correct, but they did mention that,
Yes.
which is different than what we
Right,
had
it's true.
thought.
Yeah, and I was surprised
Well,
at that, too.
I think based on, what I heard at the meetings,
Yeah.
was that the selectmen all said we wouldn't, and from their perspective, couldn't, but I think that's because of the lawsuit
Right.
concern.
Well, and I think they said that if they won a second round, they put it back out to the voters, which they can always do, too, so.
Which would
I
be,
mean, that's fine. I mean, that's, but
I think
I did not,
honestly,
yeah.
I think we could potentially be ready for the town to vote on something in advance of the February 1st. That would be ideal in my book.
Well,
So,
it appeals more necessary now
It
because,
does.
I mean, there was some speculation, throughout this second part of this presentation as to what is the legislature going to do? And again, Kate and the people who deal with the legislature really are speculating that it's going to be kick the can down the road. That there's 64 members of the House, basically, that are probably going to continue to support the governor. And he's in his last term. This is the second year of the legislative session. They're all beginning to run for reelection again. So kick the can down the road is a very likely outcome, which would mean, this doesn't mean doing nothing. It means extending the moratorium for what, till the following February? When a new legislature and a new governor are now in place. So,
but would that give them enough time to even do anything?
the legislature, you mean? No, because they're going to be out of there in April. So
So
I
they-
think they're just saying, another moratorium, we don't plan to do anything.
But what I mean is, to next February wouldn't give the new legislature
Oh.
time and the new governor to do it,
Yeah,
other than extend it again, which I think would just likely cause problems. So
probably, with the
I
voters.
have a feeling, I wouldn't be surprised if the citizens' initiative just goes ahead. We'll see.
Yeah, yeah.
I
I mean, the other thing, what you're seeing on another referendum that passed last November is they're collecting signatures again, and that has to do with the process of voting. So they're out collecting signatures to try to override what the legislature did. So the likelihood of that happening with marijuana, should they kick the can down the road, you're likely to see those people who were in favor of the adult use marijuana referendum start collecting signatures to overturn the latest moratorium again. That seems to be what's happening, so at least on that one. But okay, so for me anyway, the opt-out thing was, I guess I didn't have a sense for, that's what the referendum provided, because we've been talking about opt-in for so long, which was provided for in the thing, so.
So, did they give you a
anyway.
sense of opt-out, whether opt-out would be, we could say retail's fine, but cultivation isn't?
Yes. No,
Yes.
So you could, any one of the five, you could opt out of?
Yep.
they did stress that you need to be very specific with the social clubs for some reason.
Right.
There was a,
Yeah,
Well, social clubs, the moratorium on social clubs even goes for another year, right? So that, the current
right.
moratorium.
But they
goes
said, make sure you get specifically, if you don't want a social club, that you get that in there. So there was
Yeah.
a reason to that.
The prohibitions that are passing, and I assume it's language that they've created, are, most of them cover all five categories. But I think they're suggesting that you might need a little bit more detail, as to what you're doing and why. Public health, safety, and welfare is typically what you do for prohibitions. That's, the reason that you give. And so, but I think, so the second page here just details what the referendum does. There's considerable amount of time spent with this item, this bullet that talks about transfer or furnishing without remunerations. Apparently, there's some folks who are,
Yeah, so,
we have some of them in Cornish, basically, Cornish Inn, basically, where they are offering free marijuana if you, in the Cornish case, if you have a meal up there or if you spend the night at the inn, you get a gift of marijuana. And some of the towns are struggling with that. It's though you're not paying for it. But they seem quite confident that transferring as a result of something other than that you're doing is in fact, if somebody wants to challenge it, they're probably going to be successful. The town wants to challenge it. So if somebody's
So-
offering to give it away for free, that appears to be okay. If you're essentially getting it as a gift as a result of, say, a meal at a restaurant or because you bought something else, that probably, if it goes to court, is probably not going to be successful.
So you might want to ban a commercial giveaway.
Incentives.
Incentives, that's a good word, thank you, yes. Or there are some other words, free gifts.
So, but just banning a commercial entity from giving pot away under any circumstances, right? It has to be a retail transaction, and if we ban retail, we've banned giving it away.
No, you didn't ban giving it away,
I'm saying,
but if you,
we might have to have a ban on giving it away as a commercial entity.
yeah, as part of
In
a commercial
addition
entity.
to-
As the
Correct. Yes.
gift giving.
Yes,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
So anyway, some of the towns, and it wasn't just Cornish, I don't even know if they were there or not at that hearing, but there were other towns. Could you remember where they were from?
No, I don't think they
Skowhegan,
said.
it was a person from Skowhegan, I think maybe some of it going on up there. But I don't remember where the other was, where they were
Yeah, there
specifically.
was something I saw about,
Yeah.
almost like an Uber service where you pay nothing for the pot, but you pay $300 for the car to come to your house.
They come to your
You,
house.
you buy the glass jar
Right.
that it comes in,
Yeah.
and the marijuana inside it is a gift. It's
Yes,
a donation.
Yes, yes. So, anyway,
They
there's
did
that.
have limitations, though. Were limited on how much they could give away per person. I don't
Well, it
remember.
was that
what
same limit, it was the
Right.
2.5 ounces.
Right.
Yeah, I think
But
maybe,
they-
somebody was making that connection too, whether that was,
Now, I know
It's working for 'em
Cornish, the inn in Cornish did have a little bit of trouble from the town, and they had to switch from, giving a gift when you purchase the room to now just allowing, use on the premises inside. So I believe they did have to stop giving the gifts away, but they were still allowed to continue of allowing permission to the renters of the rooms to openly use it on the premises.
they would have to bring it with them.
Yes, so I believe they did,
The inn
because of
could
the
not.
town, having the
Yeah.
issues, they didn't like that, so they changed it to, the last I had seen on it, they said, sorry, we no longer can give it, but you can use it on premises still.
Well, Cornish is like us in the sense, they don't have a police department, so they have the county sheriff. So how they got to what they did is probably something we ought to check into. What did they have to do? Did they take somebody to court? I mean, what happened? They probably have a code
I
officer.
believe they just started making a lot of noise about it,
Okay.
and they were just a little bit apprehensive about having any legal trouble, so I think they kind of, jumped ahead and said, okay, we won't give it out anymore, we'll just allow
Okay. So
consumption.
the inn responded to the.
Just out of fear, I
concern,
believe, that
yeah.
they,
So-
to avoid any
But
issues.
this is right in line with what we've heard from a lot of the communities we've talked to and a lot of the counties we've talked to about, whatever you do, people are just going to keep pushing the boundaries and pushing the boundaries and pushing the boundaries. And, you can't think you're done.
Right.
Because they're just going to keep pushing. So,
I mean, one of the things that I've been speculating about is that, part of the rules were that if you have a retail establishment, you couldn't be selling anything else. And you couldn't be selling liquor or alcohol or tobacco in the rules that the
but I'm
legislature.
not selling it, I'm giving it away.
But as far as Acton is going, we've got 2 bars in Acton already, and this idea that building, whether it's Wild Willie's or, what's the other one down, the
Iron Tales.
Iron Tales, could make a contention that, well, we have 2 facilities, we have a door, there's
Well,
alcohol and
if we go down
booze
the
on this
path, yeah,
side.
if we go down the path of retail.
Yeah.
And, again,
That's what's
but
gonna happen.
If we do, no, it's not.
Okay.
No, it's not, because we're gonna have to have a zoning that basically says it's an individual piece of land, right?
Yeah.
And with a 300-foot separation from any other buildings, period, full
Well, I mean,
stop.
it's going to be up to us or the town to decide what to do about that, because the likelihood that those facilities are going to turn into whatever we allow them to be, and they'll be pushing.
Yeah.
And one of the pushes is, well, we have a separate building. There's a door between the alcohol side and the marijuana side, and it's a steel door.
I
And-
definitely want to go shopping in the place where the donkey stays.
Right.
Definitely.
Anyway, anybody got anything? Says the vehicle thing, do you remember any conversation about vehicles, no marijuana in a vehicle?
Oh, that you couldn't, wasn't it that if you went to an establishment and you bought, if it was opened, it was an open container?
Yes.
You couldn't open it
Right.
in your car.
We saw that in one of our conversations with the
Last
state of
week.
Washington.
Yep.
Were you on that call? Carol, you were on that call, I think. was it?
Liberty, I think it was,
Liberty, Washington, so on the Washington-Oregon border, basically, the state of Washington has said
Right, she said the same thing,
if you
right.
buy, whatever you buy a container of, you can't open it and use it in the car.
Correct. Or
Well,
it can't even be opened.
right,
Can't be
exactly.
Can't even be
With
opened.
the exception of some kind of cream.
Well, the cream had no THC,
Okay.
so there's no narcotic in it, but basically, whether you buy edibles,
Yep.
or you can smoke it or whatever, it's in a sealed package. If you're pulled over and the package is opened, it's an OUI, you're done.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, I don't see anything new on the next page. Well, I'm not sure why, and maybe this is what Rebecca was talking about. If you look at the next page, Citizens Initiated Marijuana Legalization Act, state licensing process. For some reason on this bullet, she's got retail marijuana social clubs different. Now, I don't know what it was about the,
It's the social club
what you've
that
been
she
talking about.
really specified.
yeah. Now, apparently in the referendum, for some reason, it's a separate sentence or separate paragraph, but in her mind, her lawyer mind, basically this is in a different bullet, in a different place, and I'm not quite sure why that is. But she did bring that up a couple times, that if we're going to ban social clubs, it's got to be done slightly
Specifically.
different, specifically, or whatever. Okay, so this is the tax part of it. Licensing fees, 50, so that provided for 50% of the state license fees to go to the municipality that did the licensing. But it didn't say, I mean, the state would be setting the fee, it wouldn't be the municipality, although I suppose that a municipality could set up additional fees if you had to have your fire chief go down there and inspect, or your code officer inspect, there could be additional
yep.
fees for that, so there is, but again, those fees would have to be reasonable to the cost of doing the inspection, not, it couldn't be for raising money.
No, on that aspect of it, how we spoke with the Clean Air woman,
Today, yeah.
is that something that, how she said they had to use some of their allotted amount and it was taking away from other areas? Now, is that something if we wanted air or soil samples that we're able to, directly put a fee to them, that from the beginning you pay the fee and that, in there is covering that we're gonna have someone come by for soil and air samples?
I think that appears to be in the referendum language, and it appears in that
All
legislation.
right, yeah, I just wanted to clarify on that.
Both of those municipal fees, if they were reasonably related to the cost of doing the inspection, or inspections, would be okay. So that's, a source of paying for your costs, but, yeah, I was surprised, we'll talk about the woman, the conversation.
Yeah, sorry, I
In a few
just-
minutes, no, I think.
With it just relating to
Yep,
that, I was
yep.
a little curious.
And again, the next page is this opt-out system. And again, her bullet here, be proactive if you want to regulate or prohibit. If you sit and do nothing, and the can gets kicked down the road, but they miss kicking it, and it just falls off in the drain or something, we're stuck.
And that's what's happened in both Washington and Colorado.
Yeah.
There's a number of places where they have operations that they didn't want them, but they can't do anything about it, they're grandfathered.
Yeah.
So,
Citizen initiated, okay, limited location operation. Retailers. So under the referendum, you can limit the number of retail establishments or stores. You can prohibit establishments, social clubs entirely. Local rate, you can zone. And in fact, I think we had just a sideline going on. We see this in Alfred, basically. We mentioned the other day that they've actually zoned medical marijuana too, locations. So apparently that's, you can do that apparently, so. But again, she stressed that if you're talking about zoning, you've got all of the the possibilities, but also all of the restraints of land use zone, because you're talking really about land use zoning, so.
Now, is that for a commercial location only or
Well,
residential?
Alfred has, and they provided for medical marijuana establishments in certain zones, in their commercial
Well, I
zones.
mean, because as a caregiver,
Yep.
you could operate from your home property.
Yeah, so I don't know
How
that-
would they
I don't
zone
know-
it
I don't know.
versus, a commercial warehouse, area? You're in an industrial park that they could zone it that if you want to cultivate as a caregiver in that location, you
That
could do
probably
it
is
by.
more likely. That's
But I
probably-
think too, what they're saying is, yes, you can grow in your home, but I think they can put conditions on that so that you have to have certain filtration and all that sort of thing as well. So there's, you can, from what I understand, put some building codes around it if you so
Around
choose.
even the caregiver part.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, I don't know about that. That's, it'd be interesting to find out I really should get over and talk to the code officer in Alfred to see what they did, because if you look at their zoning, it appears that they have provided a zone for
I know
medical
of a few other
marijuana.
towns that do have it, but strictly what it is just code enforcement. So making sure the building structure, electrical, all of those things are up and up on the code, because as a homeowner, if you opt to do it, you could run extension cords. And I know that, a big concern is that these lights draw a lot of power. If you're not running the proper
Right.
coded outlets, things like that, you could have shorts, cause fires, things like that.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
do know of a few towns that, are forcing the basic codes of any business or home
Okay.
construction.
But what if you're in a small town, I guess Acton more than, say, Alfred, and you decide to open a caregiver facility that's not in a commercial zone? That's okay. But you have code, because if you set up for three-phase power or using a lot of power, then that's it's a code issue, basically. If you're going to install three-phase power.
Well, I mean, building out the rooms themselves, you're gonna have coding on the studs, all the, so it's typically you're not able to just walk into somewhere and, just set up. You're gonna have to build the different rooms and locked areas under those.
So I don't know
requirements.
where Alfred is. I know that it appears in the zone, and we can find out, so. And they also prohibited, on a separate vote, the last town meeting, they prohibited all of it. So they have just two parts in their zoning, so. This is, if we're on this page that starts at the top with 14 days. So this is a concern that MMA had, that she spent some time on. The referendum now we're talking about. So the state licensing process allows only 14 days for a municipality to notify the state of approval or denial. So if somebody goes under the referendum, goes straight to a municipality looking for a license, the municipality has 14 days to notify the state of what they'd either approved or denied. And if you go down further, what they're concerned about is the state's deadline to issue a license is 90 days. So the two things don't match up. I mean, if you're expecting license applications to come to a municipality and they only have 14 days to deal with that application, that doesn't seem fair when the state has 90 days to deal with an application. I think her point was,
And also the
This-
public hearings, you needed a 10-day
Yes.
notice, so.
public hearing, 10 days notice but if you're going to do a referendum, it's a 30 or 40-day notice. For our moratorium that's coming up in a week and a half or something, we needed a 35-day notice, I think it was, 35 or 40 days. If you're just going to do, if it's going to be at a special town meeting, that's a 10-day notice. So if the town legislative body, in the case of Acton, is the town meeting, is going to do this, wants to do this by referendum, they aren't going to be able to make the 14 days.
When you say by referendum, so if the town, from a zoning, decides to do special use as opposed to permission, right? There'd have to be a town meeting to vote up or down? Is that what you're
Well, if the
saying?
town wants to, if the town it doesn't do anything, doesn't opt out, so they get a license application, and they've only got, under the referendum, they only have 14 days to approve or deny the license. Otherwise, since it's an opt-out provision, that is, it's an approved
And they'd have no,
situation.
they'd have no grounds
No
to say no.
grounds to say no after the 14 days.
But if there's a ban in place, this doesn't apply.
Right.
If you allow.
But if you're going to go,
Let's just put this under an example. So let's talk about grow. Let's say that the town decides we want to permit grows of a certain size.
Yep.
But we don't want it in certain locations. So around schools, that's fine.
Yep.
But if there's a special use area where the zoning board would have to weigh in or something, right?
but you're assuming that a town has done something. You set up a
I'm-
structure that,
Yeah, let's make that assumption, because I think
Okay.
we're going to try and do something before
okay.
this all comes.
So if your something is,
The
a
public
process-
hearing piece that I'm talking about. So
Okay.
what would require a public hearing for the town if we've got a process in place?
so if the town legislative body is going to do something by town meeting, where people assemble and raise their hands, or do it by written ballot, that's a 10-day notice
So you'd have
of
to,
that meeting. If they're going to do it by referendum, which is what we're doing for the moratorium, that's, I forgot, it was 35 or 45-day notice, which is why we're doing it on November 28th as opposed to 2 or 3 weeks before that.
so what I'm hearing is, we wouldn't want to have zoning in place if we're permitting,
Yep.
we're permitting, we wouldn't want to have any zoning that would require a town meeting to approve it.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I walked away from the seminar with, is
So special
if you're,
use.
if you're going to try to do zoning to treat anybody that wants a retail establishment the same way, then you need certain zoning, including prohibiting thing. If you're going to try to approve or deny every application that comes in for retail, so under the referendum or under the legislative bill, I'm not sure that that was dealt with. The way they talked about it, it was more of a, let's treat all retail establishments the same, as opposed to dealing with each one that applies individually. Now you're back to your opt-out or opt-in thing, so we're,
So we could limit by town vote and say we want only one.
yes. right.
But the
if-
first
if-
one that comes along,
If John comes in and applies, and you're in an and you haven't opted out, it looks like you have 14 days to approve or disapprove. This is the referendum.
no, I get it, okay.
And they're bringing this up because they're concerned about this. Municipalities have 14 days to respond, the state has 90 days. That's the bottom line.
Yep.
They're saying that isn't going to work. Okay, additional concerns. Gifting, we talked about that. Confusion between licensing and land use. I mean, when you talk about zoning, it's primarily, in all the body of law and zoning, it's all about land use. And you gotta be doing it based on the old zoning thing is the public health, safety, or welfare. Somehow, it's gotta be tied to that. Oh, and then this other thing, the fourth bullet down, exemption, so apparently, there hasn't been much discussion about this, if you're a cultivation facility, the referendum provides for an exemption for having retail stores operating within the cultivation facility. So if you have a cultivation facility that's permitted, and you decide to open a store in that same facility, there's an exemption in the referendum to do that. Do you have that recollection?
I do.
They're
And
concerned about that.
so the
And-
exemption being, they still have to get a separate license for it.
No,
No.
Oh, lovely.
In fact, if you look at the sentence here, it
That's
says retail stores, plural.
But they don't,
If you're a licensed cultivation facility, they seem to think that if you, strict reading of it, it allows that facility to open a store in that facility, but I don't know why it's plural, because they suggested
I think
that
that's just probably a print.
print, but, so I think there was, that's an exemption, so you can have a facility, but there was one sentence there where they almost implied that you could have multiple stores. Now, if you have one facility, if you have multiple cultivation
no
facilities, I don't,
yeah.
let's see. Plantations, since we have an unorganized territory, who's gonna, who's gonna deal with plantations? If somebody wants to open a retail facility in a plantation, that's not too much important to us, since we're not unorganized. Oh, this is interesting. So, and then I guess it's under their list of concerns. Apparently, the referendum allows the local legislative body, in our case it would be town meeting, to annually approve a license. In other words, you come up annually. So whoever wrote this didn't have any sense. So if you've invested in a retail establishment and you have a license, that means you have to go back to the town meeting every year to get renewed.
And what happens if they don't renew?
Guess what? Yeah, whoever 35 people show up at town meeting, and boom, hands go up, no votes, you're done. You're done. Your investment
For
is
the retail?
yes.
No, wasn't it for all of it?
All the licensing, I guess.
Yes, I
Yes,
think it
any
was all
license.
licensing.
Yeah.
That's odd, okay.
So
So a town could do nothing, have a bunch of stuff open up, and the town could then just shut it all down on an
Well-
annual basis?
if you essentially don't exercise your option to opt out, and somebody comes and applies,
I'm not,
I'm trying to figure out, I don't know how this is going to work. I don't think a court, if somebody who's invested in a facility gets a license, and then a year later, the town says, nah, we don't like you, and you're done, and you go to court, I think the judge is going to say, you can't.
Yeah,
Take the
prejudice
business.
on it.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to have some type of reasoning that
Yeah.
they're not following.
If you
laws or-
violated the laws, or whatever extent, or the zoning, if there is zoning, then.
well, and what we've seen elsewhere is that once they're there,
Yeah.
they're pretty much permanent.
But this is all, I mean, I think the MMA also felt that there'll be more new legislation as well, and some of this will get stricter,
Eventually,
like,
yeah, I think
Well-
their speculation was, we're going to
that
see,
this will not,
kick the can down the road.
And again,
Eventually,
right.
everybody's going to wake up and.
when you look at every town we've talked to in Colorado and Washington,
Yeah.
the one thing they've all bemoaned is the fact that the lobbyists are constantly changing the law.
Yeah.
So the zoning they put in place is wiped out. The protections thought they had in place is wiped out,
Change, or
right?
it gets changed.
Well,
Yeah.
they've got to stay on top of it constantly,
Yeah.
right? They're just being overwhelmed by changes because everybody just keeps pushing.
And that's guaranteed. That's what's happened with casinos, basically. Initially, it was just slot machines. Now, table games they didn't have any trouble passing table games once 5-6 years later. That's about what it would take, once you get established. So down the road, all these things are up for grabs once we get in the business. Okay, I think so they're recommending moratorium, prohibition. I think what we're seeing around us, and we've asked Jennifer to try to find from MMA to identify the towns, how many towns in Maine have adopted a moratorium, how many have adopted a prohibition of one type or another. They didn't have that readily today, but they're looking to see how they can identify. I've got a list of the municipalities. I don't know what happened in Newfield. Did you,
I did speak to somebody from Newfield.
what happened there with their vote?
I believe it's a moratorium, but it's either a moratorium or
What they voted
prohibition.
on last Tuesday was a prohibition, according to the newspaper thing.
Then
Says there
maybe
was a-
that went through. They
there
have,
was-
there's something that's stopping it right now.
Okay, so
It's
there
on-
was a woman basically in the Smart Shopper who was opposed to that, and she was putting ads in every week for 3 or 4 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, asking people to vote against what she called a moratorium, or a prohibition, but
Was one of those, it went through.
it went through. Okay, so I think and I looked at Mike has given us Sanford's ordinances. They have two things they passed in August and September. One was the prohibition, all 5 categories. And the other was you can't grow, if you're growing, it has to be behind a fence, basically.
At a public site
on
type
a
of thing,
public
yeah.
site, yes, yeah, so.
And then they've got the prohibitions and the moratoriums in
Yeah.
there. Okay,
And their recommendations, anybody got any questions about that?
looks good to me.
And ordinances. In fact, the prohibition ordinance here is exactly what Sanford adopted, so it's available. You want to talk about
Sure. So,
Spokane?
yes, so we had a call today with Julie Oliver, who's the Executive Director of the Spokane Regional Clean Air Authority, which she described as, what was it? What did she say? It's not a county, it's a special purpose district. It supersedes the county, but it basically covers all clean air in the Spokane County area. I wish I'd brought it with me. I think I left it at home. So when I first reached out to a variety of counties out west, they kept pointing me to, you need to talk to the clean air folks, and I finally got a hold of Julie Oliver. What she said was, there's a report that we have that I think I've shared with you guys, if not, I'll email it. They compared complaints, clean air complaints, 3 years prior to the approval of marijuana and the 3 years post. In the 3 years prior, the Clean Air Agency had received 174 roughly complaints for, an asphalt plant,
Rendering is the thing. I was-
rendering, yes, so which I think is our transfer station, I think.
Well, no, rendering is turning fat into.
Oh,
That's
lovely.
really.
Even better.
Smell is really,
Even better.
what they, I think with rendering is fat into Crisco or something you can.
Okay, and then,
Soap, whatever.
so basically, the industrial complaints, 174.
Yeah.
The 3 years since marijuana passed in Washington State, they've had 168 complaints for commercial operations like that, and 322 about marijuana operations. So
Yeah, I was surprised at that.
I was surprised by that.
number.
So I asked her, I said, when I first talked to Jim Doherty at the Municipal Research Services Center in Washington State, he said, marijuana has a moral smell. He said, if you love it, it smells like money, and if you hate it, it smells like sin. So I asked her, I said, is this a real problem? And she said, it is the most significant problem we're facing. She said, because it's a nuisance. Now, this gets interesting. I said, how do you handle it? This was before you guys got on.
Yeah.
She said, before we issue a violation, 3 conditions have to be met. First, and she said, first understand, we're not a 24/7 operation. We're an 8x5, Monday to Friday operation. So if somebody calls and complains on a weekend or in the morning or late at night, we don't respond. If somebody calls during our office hours and we're across the county, we don't respond. So when we respond, one of our environmental engineers, so they're either environmental engineers or a combination environmental and chemical engineers. When we respond, we have to hit 3 conditions before we issue a violation. The first is that the inspector has to verify the odor is at a certain level. And she said it's a 4-point scale. She said there's never no odor anywhere. So put that aside, that's not reasonable. So she didn't say what a 1 was, but she said from a 2 up, we will go to the second condition. A level 2 is a distinct, definite, and distinguishable odor, where you can tell certain characteristics of the odor. She said, and at level 2, she said, it's not something people would want to live next to. So if they get that, the second one is, can we validate and verify the source of the odor? And she said, winds change, right? Odors can be intermittent. So if we can't verify where it's from, we stop. She said the third condition is, if we can verify where it's coming from, the complainant has to sign on the record and appear at any appeals. So based on that, to date, they've only issued 5 violations. And she said, now, she talks to her peers, and she's saying it's problems in all the counties. And she said it's a very serious problem. They're spending a lot of time and money on it. I'll get to the money in a few minutes. So I asked her, I said, I explained to her that she explained to us that in Washington State, if you're licensed by the state, the local, whether it's the county or the city, can object, but unless there's a significant reason, the state just issues the permit and they can operate in the area. So there's no bans and moratoriums have no effect in Washington State. So I asked her, I said, I asked her to talk to us about outdoor grows and indoor grows and mitigation, right? And she said outdoor grows, she said, there is no setback that is sufficient.
Yeah, I was surprised.
I was truly shocked by that. She
300
said,
feet is, what she said?
said it's not
300 feet
adequate.
is not enough?
Yeah.
So she got into the fact that the molecular weight of the volatile organic compounds emitted by the marijuana plant can travel over 1.5 miles. And she said it's not in a straight line, and it goes up and it comes down, and she said that's what makes it so hard to validate which operation it's from. She said we have coffee roasters, composting, and rendering plants, and those have a heavier weight, and they can travel up to 1 mile, 1.5 miles, but they've been seeing marijuana traveling further than that. She said, of course, verifying the sources very difficult. So she said setbacks aren't adequate. So I asked her to comment on indoor grows, and she said, before I talk about indoor grows, you have to talk about hoop houses, by which she meant, the Quonset hut style with plastic over it. She said, that concentrates the smell, and then they roll up the sides, and now you've got a real problem. So she said, we wish we could ban those, we can't. She said, that's something you should absolutely make sure that you're managing. So then she talked about indoor. She said, from an indoor perspective, she said, basically there's 3 approaches to odor mitigation. And I pressed her a couple times on what's the most effective, and she kind of always shied away from it, but the first one she always lists is carbon filtration. She said carbon filtration works, period. The next one is ozone generator. She said that works, but unless the baffles are set up properly, the ozone can back up into the grow house and kill the plants. So she said that system hasn't been fixed yet. She said there are other systems in development, one of which is a vegetative buffer, by which she means she hasn't seen this done for marijuana yet. She's heard it talked about. Pig processors set these up, so that the big hog operations that smell awfully, they'll have a single ventilation into some very specific plants, a field of them, which absorb the odor. It has to be designed by an environmental engineer, and it has to be maintained. But it seems to work for pigs. I had read something in the materials that I downloaded from her agency about masking. So I asked her about masking, and she laughed and she said, masking is illegal. She said, in essence, they tried it at the asphalt plant once to add some chemicals to make it not smell so bad, and she said it went from smelling like bad asphalt to smelling like a bad urinal cake, and it just didn't help. She kept referring to volatile organic compounds coming from the marijuana, and I pressed her on that because I wanted to understand. I know when you buy paint, they talk about the volatile organic compounds in them as being toxic. She said, there's been no significant research on marijuana plants since the early 70s. It's in fact been illegal. They've started doing some new stuff, and what she said was that they had participated in some air sampling inside of an indoor grow with permission from the growers, that they took to a university and had them do a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer analysis of the air samples. And she said it was literally hundreds to thousands of volatile organic compounds coming off. She said some of which, yes, were toxic, but at what levels? Some of which she said we don't know. Some of which were just, awful, right? I mean, smelling wise. She said many of them are the same that you get from other plants. But there were some that were not. She said, from her perspective, more research needs to be done, Mike at this point asked a question, or actually, no, let me finish up. She basically, came back and said, if you're going to do indoor production, you need to make sure that the control technology is properly engineered. And she, at that point, said carbon or ozone, but probably carbon. And good design up front is key, but, indoor grow rather than outdoor grow is the only way from her perspective to go. Richard asked about what they monitor and how they, what they do besides monitoring there. And so she talked about the fact that they issue permits to all businesses for pollution. They inspect the business. They respond to citizens' complaints. So they have a wide remit. She said they will not respond to all locations because their people are not law enforcement and they're not trained. So if it's an illegal grow, they go nowhere near it. They can't cite an illegal grow, and she said there are illegal.
Just call the police, I think.
Call the police, but if the police
Yeah,
respond,
they look
it's a
up
different
on
question.
the books to see if there are any registered facilities within that area. If they can't find anything that would be within a reasonable distance, they call the authorities.
So Mike then asked about, well, do you regulate wood stoves?
This is a big issue that's been in Maine a couple of years ago. So the outdoor wood burner.
Yep.
It's a huge issue. If you park one next to somebody, your neighbor's downwind.
Yep.
And you're burning wet wood or something, that can be a real problem.
So I think Mike was looking at that fairness issue, because on
Yeah.
every call, he's always, if they banned marijuana, do you ban alcohol and that sort of thing? And she surprised him by saying, absolutely, we do. We respond to those wood burners. I think he was trying to get to, should you focus more on health issues than on nuisance issues? And this is when she said a couple of really interesting things. She said, in essence, you have to understand we respond to nuisance issues just as much as health issues, because these nuisance issues of odor, you're denying another property owner their property rights. So she said, yes, this is a huge nuisance issue. We don't know if it's a health issue yet, but the reality is it's one of the biggest issues they're spending time on. And she brought up something that I found particularly interesting. She referred to a board of equalization. She said, you have your tax assessments that go on.
Be the same as our Board of Tax Appeals.
Okay.
Property tax appeals. That's
And she said, we've had people who were having problems with odor go in front of this board of equalization to dispute their property valuation because of an odor problem from a marijuana grow near them. And they were given a 10% reduction in their valuation and an appropriate reduction in their tax. I've got to believe that selling that property, the property's value would have dropped for resale as well. She said further, others have since come to the county on the same basis, and the county didn't even send it to the Board of Appeals. They just granted the 10% waiver immediately. So we've talked about the income to the town. This is a potential issue for, valuation of properties, and she said this is not just happening in Spokane. So it's a tax base issue, let alone, as she said, the personal impact of the land. She also brought up that in the Lancet, which is the British medical journal equivalent of the American Medical Association, JAMA, has been coming out with people having, forgive me and don't laugh, allergies to marijuana. The bud growers have been having problems and so on, or bud trimmers have been having.
Bud tenders, yeah.
Yep.
The people at the store that deal with typically patients or recreational purchasers.
Like nicotine.
And apparently in their town, or in the county, people have said they're allergic to the smell of the marijuana, so God bless them. You asked about where the dollars came from, and what she said was, we can't use any of our state funds because they're matched by federal funds, and we can't use any federal funds for any marijuana enforcement.
Well, they don't get any of the medical or the marijuana money that goes to the state of
Right.
Washington does not
Right.
get transferred to them because they're providing a
So
service.
they can't use any of their $2.5 million annual budget.
Right.
Because it is either from the feds or state matching money. So they're getting money from the municipalities and the county based on property taxes to cover this. They're spending right now in excess of $150,000 a year responding to these problems. She said it's gone up every year.
Out of a $2.5 million budget, so
Yep.
it's still,
It's small, but she keeps saying it's significant and growing, and it's difficult funding.
yeah.
So what else did she say? There was one other thing.
James was on the call?
Yes.
You want to add anything to it?
Just about there is a lot of study going on to these VOCs, the volatile organic compounds. As she had mentioned, they're called terpenes. The lavender plant, if you ever had a relaxing tea at night, it's actually the same exact thing, aromatherapy. So the same way somebody could be allergic or get irritated from the smell of lavender or something like that, it is very reasonable to understand that you know, it does have a lot of compounds in it that someone may be, you know, allergic to it, or they just may get a rash from it. And that's where, when she had mentioned the bud tender thing, you know, it's actually fairly frequent to see people that might break out in a little hive or something because just the
Concentration.
the terpenes are, you know, it's actually limonene. If you've ever used limonene as a
pine tree,
cleaning,
pine-
yeah,
terpenes.
pine sol as
Right.
pinene. Pine trees have pinene in it as well. So they are, you know, you can use limonene, which you can find in like oranges, lemons, things like that, that it could actually be used as a solvent. So when she says volatile organic compound, it's, you know, something of that level can be used as a solvent to clean something. But at the same time, it can be ingested. But I'm sure, you know, some people might react a little bit more harshly to it than others, so, just on that
I
aspect
was
of
impressed
it.
with their, because we don't, in the state of Maine, we set up a process for people to complain. We usually draw the line where somebody picks the phone up and complains. And the line is, if you want an official complaint, you got to write it down and send it to me, email, or somehow it's got to be written. They apparently they're a little more relaxed, so this number, they're a little more, they'll take a phone call, and they have investigators, so they'll go out and follow up on it. But that's one of the things that we generally tend to not call it a complaint. You can't just phone it in. You got to do a little bit more most of the time. I mean, if
So-
it's a criminal thing, obviously it's not, but
So Richard-
Unfortunately,
we are out of time.
well, but I was going to
Just
say,
say one thing.
Yes, you can. You
So
can say
at
lots
the
of
meeting
things.
that we were at,
Yes,
Richard,
yeah.
they did talk about putting an odor ordinance in as well in
They
the
did,
town.
yes.
And I don't know how you would do that, and what your, you know,
Right.
how you would
Right.
put on that 4-point scale or something, but they did say that you could do that in your town
Yeah.
as well.
As a land use, so we have there are places in Maine that have odor ordinances, and they have, they would be happy to share. I think she mentioned Holton, I guess. I don't know what it was about Holton has a good odor ordinance. Didn't Llewellyn mention that, I think?
Oh, I think so, yeah.
So he offered to share that. So, yeah, we have some places where they've had, I assume, the
I
sardine
think it was
plants. have a-
seashells. I mean,
rendering or-
Yeah, something with that.
There's, where they have
Fish.
done rendering in Maine, particularly strong odors, and so there are places that have had ordinance. But those would be like land use ordinances, sound, smell, all those
Light,
things have a
probably.
history of having ordinances. So if we have to go that way, we can.
yeah.
but,
So
yeah.
the one thing I did want to mention was, the Director of Planning did not make the call, so
Yes.
the ordinance side of this we didn't get to cover, but you had wanted to talk about potentially changing the time or day of the meeting.
Yes, we got to do that. So Carol cannot, the other Carol Kay, cannot make
Boomway.
Fridays. She's not, it doesn't working for her. So I said to her, well, what can work for you? She said, well, how about Sunday evenings? So I was going to bring that up today. I mentioned it to Mike, and he seemed to, of course, he's like me, he's retired, so that was okay with him. What about you guys?
I'm open for, you know,
Sunday?
yeah, it's
Okay.
not an issue if we were to switch.
How about you? You're the one.
I'm open to it. The only thing I would say is my preference, if we could accommodate that, would be our big meal is in the
Yeah.
evening.
Okay.
So I would rather have it, mid-afternoon
Okay.
type thing as opposed to, if we could do that.
Mid-afternoon?
Mid-afternoon, like 4?
That's fine.
4? Is that what, is
It's
that
not really
okay?
mid-afternoon.
Yeah.
But is that okay? 4 would?
Yeah, four would work. yeah.
Yeah, here's the problem with Sunday. I'm not sure that we can get the town hall. It's not so much the town hall, it's the,
Will you work on Sundays?
don't ask him. We're going to get in trouble.
Oh, sorry, forgive me.
He works, he works for somebody, and Jennifer's going to have to call for
Okay.
the people at MetroCast,
Didn't
I
mean to
guess.
overstep, forgive
No,
me.
that's all right. So they are uncertain. I talked to Jennifer and to Elise this afternoon, uncertain about whether we can actually get permission. But so far, I don't have any objections.
No.
Carol's okay. Mike, so that's all of us.
Thank you.
I think that potentially.
Now, my only question is,
Yes.
if the Patriots are playing, is anybody going to have a real problem with
I
that?
don't watch the Patriots, so.
Not an issue for me.
Not an issue for me either. Okay, that's good. Just want to make sure.
All right. So I will check on Sundays and communicate with everybody. So, but we're not going to meet next week anyway, right?
Black Friday, yeah.
Yeah, and I did email Jen. Jen Bird is the other one. I asked her, I haven't got a response yet on Sunday, whether would work for her. I did say Sunday PM 6, so I'll go back and say Sunday 4 PM, see if that might.
By the way, could I push it to 3:30?
Maybe for the winter.
That's all, well, we're going to.
We're done. We're not going to do this all winter.
Trust me, we will not be doing this in
3:30, huh?
spring.
Right.
We won't be doing this. This will be done.
Okay, I think
So we have upcoming December 4th, we have
Yeah.
a call with La Plata County. I don't know whether it's Colorado or Washington at this point, I don't recall. And I have not heard back yet from the marijuana industry group representative who was going to get us in touch with some growers, indoor and outdoor, some retailers and some manufacturers. But as soon as I do, I'll get those.
So we're still chasing down the surrounding towns that have moratoriums or prohibitions. If we can get a list, or if we're not, we'll start calling them, and have a visit with the CEO in Alfred, see what they did specifically, what they zoned.
I would love if, obviously, we're not going to try and do the whole state of,
No.
But I wouldn't mind doing the spine of Maine to see, because if we're the only one on the border that does something, that would
Yep.
not end well.
Maybe we should take it and divide it into how many we are.
Let's see what MMA comes up with, because the
'cause
spine
they're
being
going to
all
do
up
it.
and down the border.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a good measure, too. Okay. Anything else? Thank you all.
I think
guess
that's
we're
it.
adjourned, unless somebody wants to talk some more. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
MetroCast.
Thank you.
Thanks to our audience.